For those who know me, I've been living in Oahu for about a year and a half, and for the past 6 months I've been considering flying a paramotor from Oahu to Maui. It's only about an 80-mile straight line distance, but it's never been done before for several reasons. The first of these, and foremost, is the weather and trade winds here are pretty much constant, and fighting those to make any meaningful forward progress is a challenge, which makes the second issue even more troublesome, which is a 30-mile channel crossing over the open ocean. And then on top of that, the airspace here is complicated and air traffic is congested. Even so, I built the plan with a decent route that navigated the airspace and just waited for a weather window to cooperate. And that window finally came on 25 March when I made the attempt. And this is how it was done. On the day of the attempt, I knew that weather conditions were going to be bad at pretty much every altitude below 8,000 feet. Winds were going to be high, and later in the day, it was going to be sketchy from thermal activity and mountain rotor. If you keep an eye on the palm trees, you'll be able to see just how bad the wind actually is. I knew the launch was going to be sketchy, but if I could get in the air, I knew I could eventually climb over it and make forward progress. Having a calm day at 10,000 feet and higher was really rare, and I needed it to be calm at that altitude to be able to safely make the channel crossing to be able to glide to either Oahu, where I started, or if I get far enough over the channel to Molokai, my next destination. Once I got off the ground, I was greeted with an incredible sunrise before I had to take on my next challenge, which was going to be the airspace coming off of Oahu. The Honolulu International Airport Class B airspace and its approach plate happened to be directly over my launch site on the easternmost part of the island. Because of this, to stay under that airspace, I couldn't climb more than 4,000 feet until I was several miles off the coast of Oahu, which is actually right at the limit of what my glide ratio would be on the Warp 2. Once I was finally out from underneath the airspace, I just put my wing into max climb mode and raced up to 10,000 feet as quickly as I could so that if something went wrong, I would be able to glide back to my launch site in Oahu, even from several miles offshore. The entire time I was under the airspace, I had been battling with a 20-mile-an-hour cross headwind that was limiting my progress to about 10 miles an hour. However, as I climbed out and finally crossed the threshold beyond 8,000 feet and ultimately to 11,000 feet, that quartering headwind finally dissipated. This view here is from my highest point at about 11,000 feet and at the halfway point between Oahu and Molokai. Once I finally reached the shore of Molokai, I knew that the most dangerous water crossing was behind me, and the only challenges really left were just to make sure that my fuel consumption was good and that I didn't get into any mountain rotor as I was traveling to Maui. The Nirvana F-Lite already has incredibly good fuel efficiency, but I was actually doing even better than I had anticipated, so I decided to see if I could touch another island before I went to Maui, which is going to be Koho'olawe. However, as I was descending into the island, I realized as I passed through 5,000 feet and started hitting turbulence, I looked down at my airspeed and I was making forward progress at about 5 miles an hour. I had gotten out of the relatively calm air at 10,000 feet and had descended into what was wind shear coming off of the mountain on Maui. For those who don't know, the peak on Maui is over 10,000 feet and it can create some pretty adverse weather conditions on the lee side of it. You can actually look at the clouds here and see just how different the cloud formations are where the rotor is generated by the mountain on Maui. At this point I realized I wasn't going to have enough fuel to touch Koho'olawe and also make Maui, especially if I was going to have to make progress at a snail's pace of 5 miles an hour and then climb back to 8,000 to 10,000 feet to be able to get above that headwind. So I made the decision to bail on the attempt for Koho'olawe and climb back out to 9,000 feet and turn directly towards Maui. And fortunately, as I climbed back out, I got out of that headwind and was able to make forward progress at a reasonable pace. As I began my descent into Maui, the next challenge I had to tackle was getting into and under the airspace on the approach plate into the Maui International Airport. I had been flying at 8,000 feet and the floor of the airspace that I had to get under was at 2,000 feet. With that in mind, I crabbed along the west side of the airspace to allow myself to burn altitude as I idled down and pulled trims out to be able to make forward progress, and had a really beautiful vista as I descended over the windmills and through the clouds that were generating on the east face of the West Mountain in Maui. As I approached the LZ and the gas station that I had picked out on Maui to be able to refuel, I realized that it was not going to be an easy landing. If you keep an eye on the palm trees here, you'll see that the winds are extremely high and gusting. It looked like I was going to be landing in a hurricane. But at this point I had about 2.5 liters of gas left, and I was committed to landing somewhere in the near vicinity, and the winds weren't going to be better anywhere else. As I got closer to the ground and realized just how little forward progress I was making, even at trim 6 on the Warp 2, I realized that I was going to have to do the best I could and just let trims all the way out as I go in for this landing, which again on the Warp 2 has an airspeed of about 40 miles an hour. And even with that, when I touched down, I was only going a couple miles an hour. As I touched down, I was ecstatic that I had dodged the worst of the gusts and was able to maneuver the wing into the brush on my right so that it would snag on the scrub, and there was no chance of me getting drugged at that point. So given the conditions, I was pretty excited that this went off without a hitch and I was able to land on my feet. This flight ended up being just over 100 miles covered in 3 hours and 25 minutes. Almost all of that time spent at 11,000 feet, trims completely out on the Warp 2, using about 15 liters of gas. I spent some time on the ground getting gas, eating, getting some water in my system, and talking to the locals to figure out if the conditions would get any better. And unfortunately, most of them, actually all of them, said that the conditions in this spot are pretty universally bad. Apparently, it's a Venturi effect between the two mountains on Maui, and the winds here are almost always stout. I waited around at the LZ for about an hour for conditions to improve just enough for me to get off the ground. It felt like I was trying to take off in the middle of a hurricane, but it was gusty, and as long as I could time the gusts, I figured I could get off the ground and do it safely. And God must have had his hand on me, because that's exactly how it went down. Knowing it was going to be a high wind takeoff, I set the trims to 6 and waited for a gap that fortunately came. I dodged the worst of the gusts, did a 3-step takeoff and got in the air, and was immediately greeted with almost no forward progress because of the stout wind conditions at pretty much every altitude below 6,000 feet. So I turned around, got out from under the airspace, and began to climb to try to get out of the worst of the conditions and to find the smoother air that I expected to be above about 6,000 feet. Once I got to altitude, it was relatively smooth air, so I trimmed out and took my hands off and just enjoyed the flight and the amazing views that you can really only get when flying in and around the Hawaiian Islands. If I had one regret for this flight, it was that I wish the weather had been better lower to the ground so that I could have experienced all of these beautiful Hawaiians up close and personally. But because of the rotor coming off of the mountains that are on all of the Hawaiian Islands, they were pretty untouchable without getting into an unsafe situation, so I had to simply admire them from afar. I did get tempted and did a near close pass of Molokai at about 4,000 feet, but was immediately punished with some pretty nasty rotor that caused a couple tip collapses as I was climbing out back away from the island to put it back at a safe distance. As I passed over the end of Molokai, I was once again faced with the 30-mile channel crossing, this time going back to Oahu from Molokai. Still needed to climb up to almost 11,000 feet to ensure that I'd have the glide ratio to be able to get back to either Molokai or Oahu if my engine decided to quit. While I was careful to avoid airspace, the Honolulu International Airport is really active at this time of day. And it was also really interesting at 11,000 feet to be closer to the airliners that were passing overhead than I was to the ground beneath me. The channel crossing happened uneventfully, and then I was greeted once again with the same airspace that I had to fly underneath. And so I arrived there with plenty of safety altitude, burned off some altitude that I had remaining with some wing overs, and then turned in underneath the approach plate for the International Airport. From there, it was an easy and rewarding glide back down through the clouds into my home LZ at Sandy Beach Park on the eastern tip of Oahu. And of course, as fate would have it, my GoPro battery died just as I was on approach to the landing, so I missed it. But I was able to turn it on for a few seconds after I touched the ground to at least mark the occasion. Well, of course I missed just an absolutely beautiful landing. Oh well, the journey's done. Oahu to Maui. With the help of a tailwind, that flight only lasted 2 hours and 7 minutes, covering over 90 miles at a ground speed of 43 miles an hour, and used only 9.5 liters of gas, which is impressive considering that I climbed over 14,500 feet and was trimmed out for more than 95% of the flight. Combining both flights together to give the aggregate round-trip results, total distance was 191 miles with a time of 5.5 hours and climbing a total of almost 24,000 feet and using only 24 liters of gas round trip. This was an absolute incredible journey, and it's journeys like this that make paramotoring such an awesome sport. I can't think of anywhere else where a flying machine that can take us on adventures like this can fit in the trunk of your car. There are definitely worse ways to spend a morning. Thanks for joining me on this adventure, and I'm looking forward to the next one.